But one of the weirdest of the bunch revolves around their weddings and how they treat the bride and groom. Just before the holy ceremony is supposed to take place, friends and family of the engaged couple gather together for an old tradition that is known as blackening. Basically, what happens here is the friends and family throw all sorts of substances at the bride and groom, including mud and rotten food, to make a real mess before the actual wedding begins. It is believed that this old tradition is supposed to prepare the couple for the tough challenges they will face in their new life together and act as a rite of passage into marriage. The marriage tradition states that the bride and groom must be confined to their home for 3 nights, and they are not allowed to use the washroom during this time. The tradition also calls for their family and friends to smear the couple in rice, flour, and ash, and they use this as a way to symbolize their transition into a new life together. The families and friends will also keep a close eye on the bride and groom to ensure that they do not cheat and use the washroom or wash the food mixture off of their bodies. The Indonesians believe that the couple enduring this challenging period together will serve as a trial by fire and better prepare them for the road ahead. Number 8. Mass kissing in Sweden. Okay, so to some people, this may not sound like such a bad idea when you first hear it, but when you consider that it involves a bunch of men kissing the bride-to-be, it does sound a little bit unholy in the eyes of a traditional wedding ceremony. However, these Swedish people have decided that if the groom ever leaves the room during the ceremony, then the male guests who are attending the wedding are free to kiss the bride as many times as they like until the groom returns. This definitely seems a bit out of the ordinary, but it's regarded as a lighthearted joke to keep the wedding fun and laid back. And if you thought the bride was the only one who could be a target of the kissing mania, then you would be wrong. As it turns out, the bride also has an action that can set off a total frenzy at the wedding. If she gets up from her seat at any point during the ceremony, then the female guests are allowed to kiss the groom until the bride returns to her seat. There probably aren't too many countries around the world where this would be accepted, but Sweden has fully embraced the kissing tradition. Number 7. Beating the groom's feet in South Korea. This one is probably just as painful as it sounds. After the wedding ceremony has completed and the newlyweds have started their new life together, the groom's first taste of married life is getting his feet absolutely destroyed by a whole host of painful objects. In South Korean culture, the groom's family and friends will tie his ankles together after the wedding and hold him down on a table while they search for whatever items they can find to beat his feet with. The items can range from sticks and rods and even dried fish, and the groom must endure the painful ritual until the family and friends decide that they are satisfied. On top of that, the ones doing the beating will usually ask the groom some strange riddles and trivial questions to add a bit of a humorous twist to the bizarre ritual. The beating is supposed to be a way to test the groom's strength and character, and although it may have a lighthearted feel to it, there's no way the groom wouldn't be feeling the pain for a long time after it was all over. Number 6. Carrying fire in South Africa. There are many interesting wedding traditions that take place in South Africa, but one of the oldest and wildest of the bunch is the fire carrying. This old South African tradition calls for the parents of the bride and the groom to bring fire to the home of the newlyweds. It must be pretty hard to transport a burning fire from house to house, but this tradition holds a special place in the heart of many South Africans and provides a blessing to the bride and the groom. The fire is meant to symbolize the coming together of the newlyweds and ignite the hearth in their new home. This is why it is important for the fire to be transported directly from their childhood homes by their own parents, because it will ensure that the family legacy is carried on for eternity. So while some people might think this is a little bit crazy and a bit of a fire hazard, it is an important South African tradition that will most likely last forever.
Number 5. Prison life. Being accused of being an idle and disorderly woman seems like a very vague and inconvenient statement today, as it holds no worthy of prosecution. But for these women of these times, you would definitely go to jail for that. These roughly defined offenses were common charges against women in the 18th century. At least in some records of the names of these women have survived, there are 2 on the list who are sadly identified only known as an unknown woman, cannot give any account of herself, and the other being accused of being a vagrant and an idiot. Which, of course, being an idiot isn't a crime unless you're doing something idiotic that hurts another person. Then yeah, I guess being an idiot is a crime. It is possible that up to 2/3 of prisoners in the House of Corrections, like the one at the prison called the Wakefield House of Correction, were female. Beating hemp was the usual form of hard labor. as well as if the women refused to comply or being able to commit to tasks, whipping and beatings were also a commonplace, particularly to those who convicted of vagrancy, lewd conduct, and night walking. Number 4, domestic harm. This is sort of stemming back to the whole marriage thing in number 10, as it basically ties in on how horrible life was being a woman in the Victorian era, or just being a woman in general in any historical time. With these sacrifices and determinations of these women, as they ensured the women like me were able to gain access slowly but surely to equal rights, but sadly when it comes to marriage for some of these women, they're also at risk of being in harmful relationships that were extremely normalized at the time. Violence against women and the lack of protection was common, as there were no laws for the physical violations they had to endure. After all, when you got married, everything you owned belonged to your husband, and so did your body, with or without consent. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and the 1850s. Domestic violence was an issue that captivated the Victorian imagination due to the unprecedented visibility that domestic harm began to receive in the press and the emergence of an ongoing debate during the 1840s and 1850s about the domestic harm and other marriage issues that affected women. Like all laws that slowly opened gateways to other clauses, the 1828 Offences Act that targets working class violence helped a cultural shift on the subject, and domestic violence became a topic to the public. Number 3, the angel of the house. Or the angel in the house. When it came to the liberation, it all stemmed with the women's rights group's fought for equality and over time made strides in attaining rights and privileges. However, many Victorian women endured their husband's control and even cruelty, including sensual violence, verbal abuse, and economic deprivation. And there's no way out of it, as it got worse, as a man named Coventry Patmore published a book called Angel in the House. It consisted of poems and the ideal Victorian marriage, and although it came from a place of grief at the loss of his first wife, the book had suddenly become a staple in women's behaviors in marriages, and then became a standard of their status. A woman's proper role was to love, honor, and obey her husband, as her marriage vows stated. A wife's place in the family hierarchy was secondary to her husband, but far from being considered unimportant. A wife's duty to tend to her husband and properly raise her children were considered crucial cornerstones of social stability by the Victorians. Representations of ideal wives were abundant in Victorian culture, providing women of their role models, and the Victorian ideal of the tirelessly patient, sacrificing wife is what depicted the angel in the house. And for these middle-class women, mimicking the angel in the house gave them more opportunities to find a successful match in marriage. Number 2, the House General. The House General, and a term coined in 1861 by Isabella Beeton in her influential manual, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. Because for women they needed a manual on how to be a good wife, a good woman, and a good so on and so forth. Here she explained that the mistress of the house is comparable to the commander of an army or the leader of an enterprise. To run a respectful household and secure the happiness and comfort and well-being of her family, she must perform her duties intellectually and thoroughly. For example, she had to organize, delegate, and instruct her servants, which was not an easy task as many of them were not reliable. Isabella Beeton's upper-class readers may also have a large complement of domestics, a staff requiring supervisions by mistress of the house. Beeton's advised her readers to maintain a housekeeping account book to track spending. She recommends entries and checking the balance monthly, but also keep in mind this is the same lady who told people to put borax in bread to save money. This may not seem like a big punishment for some viewers, but if you were told that you needed a manual to how to live your life so you wouldn't be kicked out of society, that's not something that's a preference today, is it? And number 1, asylum. Now, if you're a woman who was out of the realms and just didn't want to be part of society like everyone else, maybe just suffered a series of mental health issues or even just looked ugly, you might find yourself in an asylum. They had such ridiculous reasons to lock up a woman, as I mentioned in the prison section on this list. From being a vagrant, disorderly, or whatever the case was, you'd go to prison, or even more so, to the asylum. For some families, if they just didn't know what to do with you, they just toss you into the asylum for not being complicit. In an investigation by a very passionate and amazing writer named Nellie Bly, she had experienced firsthand on the field of the mistreatments, the devastating conditions, and harm patients had to endure. In her report published in 1887 and later published in the book 10 Days in the Madhouse, it caused such a sensation it prompted the asylum to implement reforms and shed the light on the significant impact on American culture. Anyways, being a woman was tough as hell in the Victorian era, but with their determination for the right to vote, the women's suffrage movement that enforced lawmakers to ensure them to obtain sustainability today is the reason why there are so many genuinely incredible women who are able to become who they want to be. And it is important to note those who do not know how to look back at where they came from will never get to their destination. So be sure to read up and learn a lot. After all, the answer in our future is laid dormant in our past. Number 10, drowning. Drowning as a form of punishment was not a common practice practiced in ancient Egypt, at least as far as historical records and archaeological evidence indicate. The ancient Egyptians had a legal system with various forms of punishment, but the various methods were typically less severe than drowning. But in records of the Code of Hammurabi, which was one of the oldest and known legal codes in human history, it provided a comprehensive set of laws covering a wide range of aspects of daily life, including civil, criminal, and commercial matters. One of the most famous aspects of the code is the principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which laid out specific punishments for various offenses. Mentioning drowning if there was adultery with a neighbor's wife, or if you had intimate relations with your daughter-in-law, more or less these punishments would go both ways, but interestingly enough, the laws depended on the person. Number 9. Disinheritance. In ancient Egypt, inheritance and property rights were complex and evolved over time, with some variations depending on the specific period and social status of individuals. Generally, women did have rights to inherit property, but there was significant differences between men and women in terms of inheritance. During the early dynastic periods, women had relatively more rights and they could inherit and own property. However, as the society became more stratified and centralized with the rise of the pharaonic state, inheritance laws became in favor more for males. By the time of the Middle Kingdom, women's rights to property and inheritance were gradually eroded. Property, especially land, was usually passed from father to son. Women could gain property through marriage contracts, dowries, or gifts, which they could then pass on to their children. But if they lose their inheritance, so do their children. Thankfully, there was legitimate ways of structuring a will, making unequal distributions of disinheriting a person so to minimize challenges which do not involve corporal punishment. These include a gift conditional upon the recipient not challenging the will, a no contest clause, diverting assets outside the will by writing a life insurance policy into trust, or passing assets through the will to a secret trust. Number 8. Banishment. In ancient Egypt, as in many ancient societies, the legal system was complex and the punishment for various offenses could vary depending on factors such as the severity of the crime, the societal status of an individual involved, and the time period in question. Banishment was one possible punishment, but it was not the common form of punishment. Banishment in ancient Egypt was being expelled from a community or city was generally used for serious offenses or crimes. It was a severe punishment because it meant the individual was cut off from their community and likely left to fend for themselves in the harsh environment outside settled areas. And for women, it was typically a rare occurrence as the legal system in ancient Egypt was based on the code of law that changed over time, and evidence suggests that women could be subjected to various forms of punishments for their crimes, including banishment. Number 7. Punishment. More commonly, punishments for women in ancient Egypt might have included fines, corporal punishments, or forced labor. For serious crimes, especially those that threatened the social order or involved treason, more severe punishments like execution might be applied, but in some cases for less serious offenses, women might be required to pay fines. These fines could be in the form of money, goods, or livestock. Women, particularly those of lower social status, could be sentenced to perform labor as a form of punishment. This might involve agriculture work, construction, or other forms of manual labor. Depending on the nature of the offense, a woman's property or belongings could be confiscated as a form of punishment. As mentioned earlier, banishment was a possible punishment for serious offenses. Number 6. Beatings. In ancient Egypt, like in many ancient societies, corporal punishment, including beatings, could be a form of punishment for women, particularly for offenses that were considered serious or morally reprehensible according to the prevailing nature and culture and legal norms. It's important to note that the application of punishment varied depending on factors such as societal status and specific time period and the region within ancient Egypt. Corporal punishments such as whipping, beating, or other forms of physical punishment could be administered for various offenses. This might be more common for crimes like theft or adultery. Examples would be like switches, flexible branches, or vines could have been used for beatings. They would be capable of inflicting pain without causing severe injury, as wooden paddles with a flat surface could also be used for beating as well. They would also have been effective in delivering blows to specific areas of the body, and the simplest form of beating would be involved with the hands and fists. This method would also be easily accessible and wouldn't have to require any specialized tools, as well as whips, sticks, and rods. Number 5. Patricia Krenwinkel. As of 2022, Patricia Krenwinkel, now 74, was convicted of 7 counts of first degree in August 1969 for the Manson family attacks that left 7 people dead. She was also known as the Manson Girl when she was arrested in Mobile, Alabama. It was during the summer of 1969 where Charles Manson ordered his members to end the lives of 7 people in Los Angeles, including actress Sharon Tate. During the trial, Patricia Trial's attorney, Paul Fitzgerald, suggested that although her fingerprints were found inside the Tate home, she might have been an invited guest or friend. Seemingly unfazed by the possibility of a guilt verdict and a death sentence, Patricia reported spent much of the trial drawing doodles of devils and other satanic figures. All during the trial, she remained loyal to the Mansons and the family. Demonstrated of this unity included walking hand in hand with Atkins and Van Houten, singing songs written by Manson, as well as shaving their heads and carving a giant X on their foreheads. Number 4. Sarah Alderte. Sarah Maria Alderte Villarreal is a Mexican alleged serial killer who was convicted for supposedly heading a drug smuggling and human sacrifice cult with Adolfo Costanzo. The members of the cult, dubbed by the media the narco-satanist, called her the godmother, with Costanzo as the godfather. In 1989, the killings grew more frequent and gained attention when American tourist Mark J. Kilroy, a University of Texas student on spring break, was abducted. Costanzo's Alderte and the rest of the cult went on the run when detectives discovered their shrine. They found human hair, brains, teeth, and skulls at the site. Eventually, the police found their hideout. Alderte was convicted of criminal association in 1990 and jailed for 6 years. In the second trial, she was convicted of several of the killings of the cult's headquarters and sentenced to 30 years in prison. If Alderte is ever released from prison, American authorities plan to prosecute her for the murder of Mark. If Alderte is ever released from prison, American authorities plan to prosecute her for the death of Mark. Number 3. Leonarda Cianciulli. Known as the soap maker of Correggio, Leonarda Cianciulli was a serial killer from Italy. Cianciulli was devastated after learning that her son was going off to prepare for the war in World War II. To keep him safe, Cianciulli offered human sacrifices. She killed 3 of her neighbors with an axe and made tea cakes out of their remains. Not only would Cianciulli eat these cakes, but she would also serve them to guests, and Cianciulli's third victim, Virginia, who was made into both teas and cakes and bars of soap. Once again, this soap was gifted to friends and neighbors, and Cianciulli was eventually sentenced to 30 years in prison. Sorta sounds like the femme version of Sweeney Todd, but a Bath and Body Works edition. Number 2. Enrica Marta. Often referred to as a vampire owing to the nature of her crime, it is generally believed that Marta kidnapped kids off the streets of Barcelona and put them in her work brothel. It's also believed that Marta killed minors and used their blood and remains in various elixirs. She then sold these elixirs to the rich, claiming that they treated dangerous ailments like tuberculosis. 12 victims have been linked to her, although it's suspected that she killed many more. Although some historians defend Marta and argue that her crimes weren't as bad or as many as the traditional stories suggest. She was actually detained and jailed in the Reina Amalia prison. Further investigation revealed more housing in Sant Feliu de Llobregat, property of Marta's family. Here they found remains of children in vases and jars, as well as books of remedies, including a list of rich clients who the police apparently tried to hide from being leaked, including rich politicians, doctors, and businessmen, and bankers. Kinda similar to a case we had in our modern times with a guy whose name rhymes with Lefri Nipson. Although she was arrested, she was never tried since she died in the hands of her prison mates, and companions ended up lynching her. Apparently, some say her wealthy clients hired the prisoners to shut her up. It's very interesting how history repeats itself sometimes, as this was in 1913. Proving to be one of Victorian era's most infamous criminals, Amelia Dare could be one of the most prolific serial killers in human history. Back in Victorian England, she was paid for adopting babies in a practice known as baby farming. Amelia Dare turned this into her profession and adopted numerous children. She began by keeping them for a time until they passed of a natural cause, but ultimately turned into disposing them shortly after adopting them, thereby keeping the money without having to raise them. One of Dare's victims was actually found floating in the river Thames on March 30th, 1896, leading to her arrest and eventual execution. While 6 victims have been confirmed, it's believed that Dare may have killed up to 400 children throughout her life. In one of the most sensational trials of the Victorian period, she was found guilty and later hung. Coverture, also known as martial unity or femme covert, was a legal doctrine that existed in many Western societies until the 19th century, but also, in some way they're still kind of there. The concept of coverture significantly impacted the legal status and rights of women upon marriage. Once the central aspects of coverture was the merging of a woman's legal identity is that of hers and her husband's were as of one upon marriage. This meant that in the eyes of the law, a married woman and her husband became a single legal entity. Any property that she owned, including real estate and personal belongings, would become her husband's upon marriage. She could not enter into contracts or control her own finances independently, and in cases of divorce or separation, the legal custody of children were almost always granted to the husband, as the legal doctrine considered him to be the head of the household. The impact of coverture varied across different jurisdictions and evolved over time. While coverture was deeply ingrained in legal systems for centuries, it faced increasing criticism during the 19th century and eventually underwent reforms. The movement of women's rights, including the first wave of feminism, played a significant role in challenging and dismantling coverture laws. Number 9. Coret Regulations. During the late 19th and early 20th century, there were instances of corset regulations in some regions. Particularly in the United States, these regulations were attempts to address concerns about women's health and their public morality and the potential impact of corsets on the female body. Some US states and cities enacted laws that specifically specified the maximum length of corsets. These regulations were aimed at preventing the creation of extremely long corsets, which were considered not only a fashion concern, but also a potential health risk. Enforcing corset regulations proved challenging as it required monitoring and measuring women's undergarments, which were both impractical and invasive. Compliance was difficult to ensure, and these regulations were not universally followed or reinforced, as over time, societal attitudes towards women's fashions and health evolved, and the popularity of corsets waned. Ultimately, the decline of corsets in women's fashions was driven by challenging aesthetics, fashion preferences, and evolving views on women's health. Number 8. Anti-flirtation laws. Anti-flirtation laws were laws or ordinances that at various points in history sought to regulate or prohibit what was considered inappropriate or aggressive flirting behavior in public spaces. These laws were often subjective and reflecting societal norms and values about modesty, decency, and public conduct. The term anti-flirtation laws is commonly associated with the early 20th century in the United States. During this period, some cities enacted laws or regulations aimed at curbing what authorities deemed as inappropriate or unwanted flirtatious behavior. In some cases, though, anti-flirtation laws were actually presented as a measure to protect women from unwelcome advances or harassment. The laws were framed as a way to ensure that a woman could move through public spaces without facing unwanted attention. Enforcing anti-flirtation laws posed challenges, as the laws were vague and determining what constituted inappropriate flirting was inherently subjective. The laws were sometimes criticized for being overly intrusive and arbitrary. Anti-flirtation laws faced criticism from various quarters. Civil liberties advocates argued that such laws encroached upon individuals' rights to free expression and personal interactions. As societal attitudes became more permissive, the enforcement of these laws ended up becoming increasingly unattainable. Number 7. Unequal inheritance laws. Historically, many societies had laws governing inheritance that were unequal and discriminatory, favoring male heirs over female heirs. These laws, rooted in patriarchal norms, often restricted women's rights to inherit property, land, or other assets. Practice like primogeniture is a system of inheritance in which the firstborn son inherits the entire estate of the parents, as this practice excludes daughters and younger sons from inheriting significant portions of the family's wealth. The Borough English system was also a variant of primogeniture in which the youngest son inherited the family estate, while the elder sons received other forms of compensation. Like primogeniture, it disadvantaged daughters in terms of inheritance. While dower rights provided some protections for widows by granting them a portion of their husband's estate, they were often limited compared to the inheritance rights of sons. Dower rights varied, and in some cases widows received only a life interest in a portion of the estate. Over time, reform movements and challenges and changes in societal attitudes led to legal reforms aimed at addressing gender-based inequalities in inheritance. These reforms sought to ensure the daughters had equal rights to inherit all the family property, or whatever is in the will. Number 6. Restrictions on working hours. Restriction on hours for women were common in various parts of the world, often based in societal norms, gender roles, and concerns about women's well-being. These restrictions were part of the labor laws or social norms that limited the hours when women could work, the type of jobs that they could engage in, and in some cases the conditions under which they could work. Laws and regulations in many places historically imposed restrictions on the number of hours women could work in a day or a week. These restrictions were often based on the assumption that women needed protection and rest during their roles as caregivers in the family. Certain professions and industries had explicitly exclusions for women, limiting their participation based on perceived physical or emotional limitations. For example, some jurisdictions restricted women from working in certain heavy industries or underground mining. Over time, however, changes in social attitudes and evolving perceptions of gender roles contributed to the relaxation of restrictions on working hours for women. As the women's rights movement gained momentum, there was an increase in recognition of women's rights to work without undue restrictions. Number 5. Status degradation. Status degradation still persists today, and it's been used as a formal punishment throughout history. Under the Roman Emperor Augustus, who reigned from 27 BCE to 14 CE, a woman guilty of adultery could lose several rights as a citizen and suffer a financial burden. Noble women in the Kingdom of Korea during the Joseon dynasty faced a similar degradation of their social status if they were found guilty of adultery or if they just remarried. Adulteresses were stripped of many of their rights and privileges once they were demoted to low-born statuses, and the descendants of widows who remarried were barred from holding office. As serious as these punishments may seem, some high-status women who committed adultery in the Joseon dynasty faced even graver punishment, which is death. Number 4. Pricking and scratching. Another form of torment women had to endure as a type of punishment relates back towards one of the biggest torments women had to face during during the witch trials. Witch hunting books and instruction pamphlets, yes, they had an IKEA manual on how to prick a witch, it noted that marks were insensitive to pain and they couldn't bleed. So they would make these specifically designed needles to repeatedly stab and prick at the accused's flesh until they discovered a spot that produced their desired results. So basically they would just keep poking you with needles until there was an area on you that just didn't bleed. They even had a job position for this called professional prickers, which many of them would be con men using dulled needles points to identify fake witch marks. Alongside the pricking was the scratching, where they would scratch the supposed victim. So if a victim scratches the accused witch with their fingernails and drew blood and their symptoms of being possessed stopped, then somehow that person that they scratched was a witch. Number 3, tar and feathering. When I first heard about tar and feathering, it was in a cartoon where the characters would use tar and then feather the characters they wanted to make a fool out of. Tar and feathering originated as a punishment that dates back to Richard I of England. The practice of tarring and feathering was exported to the Americas, gaining popularity in the mid-18th century. Throughout the 1760s, it saw increased usages as a means of protesting the Townshend Revenue Act and those who sought to enforce it. For women, they'd also tar and feather as a form of embarrassment. In a news article in 1906, consisting of 4 young married women from the East Sandy, Pennsylvania, corrected the alleged evil conduct of their neighbor, Mrs. Hattie Lowry. 2 women held Mrs. Lowry to the floor while the others 2 smeared her face with stove polish until it was completely covered, and then poured thick molasses on her head and emptied the contents of a feather pillow over molasses. The women then marched the victim to a railroad camp tied by the wrist, where 200 workmen stopped to watch the spectacle. After parading Mrs. Lowry through the camp, the women tied her to a large box where she remained until a man released her. They did this because they wanted to be part of a vigilant committee which exercises the right to take up the law in their own hands. Reason why they did that to her, though, is still unknown. Justice for Mrs. Lowry. Number 2, amputation. Although it may not seem to be as creative as the other instruments of torture on this list, amputation packed a painful and permanent punch. The body of an ancient Chinese woman from about 3,000 years ago have been found with an amputated feet but in otherwise good health, and all signs point to an ancient Chinese punishment called yue, which was used for over 500 different offenses, including cheating and stealing. In ancient Egypt and the Byzantine Empire, a different type of amputation was common: nose amputation, called rhinotomy, which was a punishment for adulterous women, though it was also used as a punishment for various crimes in medieval and ancient times elsewhere. However, the adulterous man might escape with a less severe punishment like a fine or a beating. Number 1, burnt to death. Although it is noted that the most famous form of torment and method of getting rid of a witch was to burn her or burn them by the stake, but this was more common in Europe during the very early 1300s to the end of the 17th century. In England and most of their colonies, the witch trials would go on like every other crime, and when someone was convicted of witchcraft, typically they would be hanged. But with the burning alive, that was more specifically used in Europe, especially in Scotland. Women accused of witchcraft and communing with the devil would be burnt, but it was also a common punishment for treason or heresy. A woman might have her limbs covered in tar, as well as being made to wear a tar-soaked dress and bonnet, and she would then be tied up by the neck on a barrel and the fire would be lit. She would be simultaneously burnt and hung in a blazing inferno, or they wouldn't bother to hang her, instead placing a bundle of twigs around her feet so she would be consumed in a sheet of fire and burnt alive. Notably, another famous person who was also in this unfortunate spectacle was Joan of Arc.